Lisa Rubel of Love to Color My World, and I'm here to walk you through the steps to put together block number 5 in the Sunshine and Shadows block of the month. You can see it in our quilt top right here behind me. It looks almost like a hashtag with the yellow and white and the gray in the background. So I've got my pieces cut. Let's get started making our block. The first step is to make half square triangles for these 4 spots right here. So I've got 2 white squares and 2 yellow squares, and I'm going to draw a diagonal line on the wrong side of my white squares from one corner to the opposite corner. And then I'm going to pair each of those squares right sides together with a yellow square, and then sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance away from that center line down one side and back up the other side, and I'll do that on both. I've got stitch lines on both of those squares, so the next step is to take my ruler and align it on that drawn line and cut these open. So from each of those 2 pairs of squares, I get half square triangles. I'm going to press the seam toward the yellow. And then for each of these, we'll be trimming them down to the size that we need for our blocks. And that will also take care of trimming off those little corners that stick out from making the half square triangles. So for these, we're going to trim to 3.5 inches square. I'm going to align the diagonal line on my ruler with the seam, and then trim off the excess on 2 sides and flip it, and do the same on the remaining 2 sides. So I'm going to do that for all 4 of my half square triangles. Here's my finished half square triangle. Like I said, I've got 4 of them. And now it's time to lay out the block. The rest of the piecing is all about getting our seams aligned so that we create the shape of the finished block. So I'm going to start out with a gray square in the center, and then put the yellow squares above and below and on the sides of it, and then our half square triangles in the corners. And we'll start with these and then add in the sort of outer border of this block. So I'm going to piece these by flipping this middle row over onto the first row, and then I'm going to string piece all 3 at a time. And that way they will all be in the correct order and all touching each other so I don't get them messed up. So I have these all lined up, and I'm going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance down all 3 of these and then come back to the cutting board. So I've got those first 2 vertical rows sewn together, and now what I'm going to do, without clipping between the pieces and without pressing, is I'm going to fold all of these back open. And then I'm going to take this 3rd vertical row and put them all on top of that middle row. And then I'll stitch down these the same way I stitched down the first, and I'll have my rows together and everything is all nice and organized. So I've got all 3 of my rows laid out here. And the advantage of doing it this way, is you can even pick them up and all of your pieces are together. So you can make sure that you don't have one of the rows flipped around or one of the pieces flipped around. So now I'm going to cut these apart and press my rows. I'm going to press the top and the bottom row in towards that center square, and then the middle row I'm going to press out from the center square. And I do that because then when I will join those rows, the seams will nest and we'll have nice even joins. There's my top row pressing in. This row presses out. and then pressing in again. Okay, there we go. So now I'm going to join these 3 rows together. I'm going to start by flipping this one over the center, and you can see how my seam allowances go in opposite directions. So they'll nest real nicely and I can get a good join there. Put a few more pins in at this other seam join as well. Okay. Then I'm going to sew the 1/4 inch seam allowance down here, and after I have that added on, then I'm going to add this bottom piece down to create the block center. So here's my block center. Now I'm going to press those seams that I just made. And I'm pressing them out from my center row. Okay, let's take a look. There we go. Okay. Now it's time to add the white and gray border. So the gray pieces will go by the yellow squares, and then the gray squares will go in the corners. And then the white pieces, and if you're using a white on white like I am, make double sure that your fabric is facing right side up, but we'll fill in the holes. So when I go to assemble this, I'm going to start out by sewing the strips on the sides together. So I'm going to make 4 of these pieced border units for the block, and then 2 of them will go on the sides of the block, and the other 2 will add the gray squares on the corner to add to the top and bottom to finish up our block. Then when I go to add them to my center block, once again, my seam allowances will nest. And what I'm going to do is flip this over, and I'm going to sew from the center block side. And the reason I'm going to do that is so that when I'm stitching along here, I can see where the 2 stitch lines join so that I can create a nice point on my half square triangle. And if I have the border side up, I can sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but if I'm slightly off, I won't know it. And by sewing on this side, I can see and I can adjust so that I meet that intersection just as I want to. All right, let's take a look at this first side that I have on, and you can see both of my points on those half square triangles are nice and pointy. So I'm going to add the second side in the same way. And I've got my 2 side borders added on, and I've stitched the gray squares to the end of the top and bottom border. And I'm going to press those gray squares in, again, so that my seams will nest. And then we'll add those to the block center, and our block will be complete. Now, when you are adding these on, and you go to pin, make sure that you put a pin in at each seam intersection, and that will allow the block to have a nice clean look to it where all of your seams match up. So I'm going to put a fair amount of pins in, and then same as for the sides, I'm going to turn this over. I'm going to stitch on the block's center side so that I can see where those half square triangle points are. Here's my finished block. Got the gray and white border around the outside and the yellow center block with the gray middle, and you can see I've got nice clean points because of how I pinned and stitched together. So now we're done with month 5 of the Sunshine and Shadows block of the month. Next month we'll be working on block 6, which looks like this. and I hope that you'll join us. See you then.